Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and welcome to episode 40. Believe it or not, we're up to show 40 on the One Human Nation Show. And remember, the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. Well, it has been a busy week, a busy and emotional week. So I was trying to really figure out some ways to pull together what we've gone through as a nation this week, what we've gone through as a community in the community of Savannah. And for those of you that are listening other places, I'm sure you've got local stories of what's going on in your community that really continues for me to emphasize the reason why we need to focus on reconciliation, healing, and truth. So if this is the first time of tuning into the show, I do want to give you some logistics of referencing the website onehumannation.info for resource materials, because some of what we are talking about is a continuation of topics that was introduced at the first show, which was back in April 13th of 2017. Wow. Yeah. 2017. So we continue to grow and develop on our journey of race reconciliation and how this kind of bleeds into things that are happening, whether it's on the national level, whether it's on the state level, and particularly what happens on the local level, because I do believe that that's where we have a huge impact in our communities by knowing where to engage. So I'm going to read you a definition that I found on a concept that we've talked about before, but really it's something that I constantly am getting my head around, and it's this whole concept of ethnocentric, and what it means to be ethnocentric and being an ethnocentrism kind of state of mind. And this definition goes into the major reasons for divisions amongst members of different ethnicities, races, and you know how much I just love that whole race term since it's something we created, and religious groups in society, as well as political groups. Ethnocentric individuals believe that they are better than other individuals for reasons based solely on their heritage. Clearly, this practice is related to problems of both racism and prejudice. So, while many people may recognize the problem, they may not realize that ethnocentrism occurs everywhere and every day at both the local and political levels. And I think what stands out to me is that when we see it now, as we continue on our race reconciliation journey, as we wake up more to it, there are things that kind of speak to us on this level. And one of the events that happened was on February 12th, and it was a speech that was being made by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and and he was making this speech to the National Sheriff's Association at their winter conference. So this was, like I said, February 12th. And the statement that he made was one of those statements that kind of set off this whole dynamics of what did he really mean by that. And to quote, the statement that he said was, "The office of sheriff is a critical part of the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement. We must never erode this historic office." Now, the use of the phrase Anglo-American was not in the initially prepared remarks released by the Justice Department. And the difference is in the wording that it was part of the sheriff is a critical part of our legal heritage. So there's been this whole conversation back and forth, and Facebook back and forth from different people weighing in on that's really code for the way we do things in this country is going to continue to support a more white supremacist roots, saying that it's okay and you are the watchdog to make that happen. And I've mentioned before that in watching some dynamics at the local level between the culture within the sheriff's department and the culture in the Savannah Police Department, totally different. So you kind of need to know what's going on. And I know I'm diving in kind of with some of the hot topics that are going on so we can start putting things into, I hope, perspective. And I realize it gets emotional, and I'm not in any way want to belittle, especially some of the more detrimental events that have occurred, like the shooting in Florida at the high school. And when I see these dialogues going back and forth, these conversations, well, it was because, this was a person that needed to get some help because of mental issues. And there seems to be a lack of really wanted to embrace, well, what do we really need to do about the gun violence, as well as helping the students, the young people that need to get additional assistance. So there is some positive in this, believe it or not, and you may be wondering what that positive is I have been tracking what's been going on with the Savannah Chatham County public school system. And if you haven't engaged as far as watching any of their meetings, I would encourage you to do so. Now, you may be living in a different school district, and I would encourage you to do that in your school district. Hopefully, these are recorded the way they are in Savannah, because I realize that people are working during the day when these activities occur. But this is where you can really get a sense of what's going on with policy, what's being presented to policymakers, and really starting to look beneath the surface. So some of the positive things, and this was also mentioned in the State of the City address from Mayor Deloach for the city of Savannah. He also touched base on some of the positive things happening with the city as it relates to the school board. And so one of the things that was presented at the school board meeting, which on the surface may sound like, well, it wasn't positive, it was in reference to this a recommendation to make some adjustments in a program that I'll refer to as Operation Bacon, because that's what it's referred to here. And it is highlighted by this person that presented the information. She's actually a professor of sociology at Georgia Southern University, Armstrong campus, and she wanted to address some of the policies concerning Operation Beacon, and really highlighting that it's a form of institutional discrimination. And what it really gets into is volunteer participation in the public school district, and specifically in the Savannah Chatham County public schools. And I've mentioned before on the show, and if you're engaged with the Chatham County School District, the Savannah Chatham County School District, there are some problems just on how the schools have become more segregated with a higher population of African American and Latino families, and there's kind of an imbalance of what's going on in the education system. So if you just listen to it or talk, hear about it, you think everything is really totally hopeless. And then we continue to see the youth violence in the city, so it contributes to that. But this is something positive that came out of someone observing this which should be a very beneficial volunteer program to try to get parents to participate and volunteer their time, and it appears that the process has makes it difficult if someone wants to participate and they have for some reason are getting kicked out of the system. And she observes that a large portion of the Savannah-Chatham County student body comes from underserved communities. And so when you filter out potential volunteers with any non-violent criminal offense, decreases this representation from this particular group that you want to be engaged and involved. And she goes on to quote a study that students have teachers and role models from their backgrounds perform academically. And she goes on to state, because she's not talking about throwing out, everything. Obviously, if you've got volunteers interacting with kids in our schools, we've got to have some system in place to screen people. And she makes a recommendation of what that should be. And it does take a look at, making sure that volunteers, should not have a violent crime offense on record, and volunteers should not have a sexual offense on record, and they should not have offenses related to domestic issues or offenses related to children. And then basically all other parents should be able to apply without exclusion. So I guess the way the current policy is worded, it excludes, for whatever reason, someone else that is that they have a more defining way to limit that participation. So there is an opportunity for you to contact your school board members, so for Savannah-Chatham County School Board, and let them know before the next school board meeting, which I think is March 7th, that what your opinion is and whether you support having things with a little bit more flexibility to get some more volunteer engagement, recognizing, we're not talking about throwing out, I hate to use this expression, baby with the bathwater, but that's the only thing that comes to mind right now. So it's a matter of saying, okay, let's be realistic about that, and how can we get people engaged, because it is a process. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there may be even a fee that has to be paid, and of course there's a background check and all of that has to happen, as well as if I'm not mistaken, there's also a training process, as it should be. But it makes sense to me on a common sense level that we should be looking at getting as much community engagement as possible from all sectors of the community. And one of the things I've noticed about Savannah is that there is a large population of retired people. And just because you're retired doesn't mean that you just, disengage and, not have concerns about what's going on in your community. And a lot of retired people do. And this could be a way to engage with our youth. The other part that was interesting to me about what was happening in the Savannah-Chatham County School District is something called the Savannah Renaissance Plan. And this occurs in other communities, too, that are trying to serve a market where there may be more dysfunction going on in the household. Because the reality for me, I had to get my head around the fact that things are very different from when I went to school. And even though you may have had single parents, which we did, but there was more of a community involvement in what was happening with that child, whether it was through engagement through church or just in the community. I mean, adults knew who the kids were, and they would engage them in conversation. So you never felt like, which was kind of an irritation for me at the time, you never felt like you were truly out there alone. You always knew that there was some adult probably watching what was going on. So one of the things that Chatham County is looking at is the root cause of poverty for the next 2 years. And they already have one facility, I think, and they're looking at focusing on the early childhood education facility. And this is all about the Savannah Renaissance Plan. And it specifically focuses on 3 to 5 year olds. And what's important to me about that is if we can capture and really give 3 to 5 year olds a different perspective on life, it could help in what happens later on in life, that disconnect that happens, because I had to get my head around, and I still do. I'm still amazed when I'm around really young children, how much they get, how much they absorb, how much they are, for better or worse, exposed to. And I think I've mentioned before, they can operate my phone better than I can. So as we continue on with the show today, we're going to listen to some clips that really try to get us to focus on what are we bringing to the table with our unconscious bias? What are we, and we've mentioned unconscious bias before, and what that, and how difficult it is, because it requires us really taking a look inside ourselves and going, okay, what is it that we don't even recognize when it happens. And if you ask someone, are you prejudiced? Most people are going to say, no, I'm not prejudiced. And so this first clip that we're going to listen to is from a TED Talk from this person. I think her name is Christina Presnan, but I will post it on the One Human Nation website also. And she's an Anglo female, and unfortunately you won't see the visual of her, but she's an Anglo female. And so she talks about her story in recognizing her unconscious bias. So let's take a listen.
Okay, so let me just get this out there. I have a bias against women leaders. No one could be more surprised about this than me. I'm a woman leader. And on top, I even work in human resources, which means it's kind of my job to be unbiased. In fact, I passionately encourage women to step into leadership. My poor kids would definitely tell you I never stop talking about it. But in spite of my strong belief that women make great leaders, I've realized I don't always act like it. Not long ago, within the same week, 2 members of my team asked me to take a look at their compensation. My first reaction to the man's request was something like, yeah, I'll look into it. My first reaction to the woman's request was something like, I'm pretty sure you're good. A day or so later, I'm sitting at my desk, hard at work, and I somehow connected what, up until then, I'd seen as 2 separate events. I'd had 2 very different reactions to basically the same request, and I thought, what's up with that? Might I be biased and not even know it? But I know what you're thinking. This is 2016. It's not a topic. Women leaders are everywhere. Maybe you, like me, have personally hired or promoted lots of women leaders. But then I thought, with all this talk of unconscious bias, might something be going on that I'm not even aware of, if it's unconscious and all? For those of you who might not already have been inundated with this in the corporate world, it's a simple concept, and it's backed up by neuroscience. Our brain has to handle way too much information. So in order to manage it all, our brain takes the liberty of looking for patterns and filtering for us what it sees as the most important bits, like autopilot. Our brains take shortcuts. Without these shortcuts, we'd have to sit and really think through way too much information. Imagine if every single time you had to think through everything from how to open doors to how to shake hands to how to sing happy birthday. But brain shortcuts do have a downside, because they see patterns that are based on the cumulative effect of everything you've been exposed to throughout your life. Which means the whole thing is happening also in the back of our minds, which means we're not even aware that it's happening. This can cause us to behave in ways that are not true to who we want to be or how we feel we are, and we might not even know it. unconscious bias sounds kind of clinical, but I looked it up. And other words for unconscious are comatose, paralyzed, or senseless. And other words for bias are bigotry, intolerance, and unfairness. Okay, so that would mean we're not just unconsciously biased, we're actually senseless, intolerant bigots. So that's not something I want to be, consciously or unconsciously. And here's the scary part. Most of us think we can outsmart it. We believe it when we say things like, I don't see race, or I just hired the best person. It just so happened that at the time of the 2 pay requests, I was doing research on unconscious bias. And the research said, these are our expectations of men. We expect them to be assertive and strong and driven. And these are our expectations of women. We expect women to be helpful and sensitive and supportive. If we were to make it a little bit tighter, we see men as taking charge and women as taking care. No, it's not because every single one of us is a misogynist. It's simply because men taking charge and women taking care is what we've mostly been exposed to throughout our lives. And our brains will do the rest, unconsciously redirecting us into those patterns that it recognizes. Still feeling like this bias couldn't possibly belong to me, one of the words jumped out at me. Wait a minute. Do I see the man as a provider, and so I looked at his pay request more seriously? And do I not see the woman as a provider, and so I've somehow dismissed her request? In that moment, I had to realize I do. I see men as providers, but not women, which is really interesting because I'm the sole financial provider for my family of 6. My husband is a stay-at-home father for our 4 children. I take charge, and he takes care. I'm the last person I could imagine who could ever have a bias against women leaders, and yet I had to realize I have a bias against women leaders. I have a bias against myself.
If you've just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. So we're talking about bias because this is actually, I think, an unconscious bias specifically, and how it's so hard to recognize within ourselves. And I want to bring that up because it is, I think, going to be even more something we need to be conscious of as we continue into 2018 and elections that are going to be taking place. Specifically, I'm thinking in terms of the school board elections, but there are other elections coming up also. And the question to ask, is there some unconscious bias that we have that is steering us towards one candidate more than the other? And are we being honest about that? And so one of the easier ways to swallow that is when we look at the male-female binary relationship. It gets even more complicated when we put the race equation in there, because then it's like we really feel like I'm a bad person for thinking that way. But it's part of the journey of reconciliation. We have to start looking at these really difficult topics because what we really need are the best people in these positions, regardless of their gender, regardless of their ethnicity, or, I hate the word race, but that's where we are. And the question becomes, is there something that we can do to increase our awareness because I recognize that not all of us are working in that world, that we have to look at diversity and unconscious bias on a daily basis. But unfortunately, we have to deal with it on a daily basis. You have to deal with it when you're, dealing with your kids in school, or even, selecting healthcare providers, or it just goes on and on and on for whatever services that you're looking to do. Unfortunately, because we're dealing with people, we have to look at, what am I bringing to the table that may be creating more of the problem, or when we feel that tension, when we feel that uncomfortable place, where is that coming from, and how can we change that? So the second part of this clip from Kristen Pressner talks about what she did to try to flip the switch in her head. So let's take a listen to that.
Flip it to test it. If it feels weird, you might want to check yourself. The more I tried it, the more I saw the value. In fact, there's this Twitter account that just flips the gender of things we commonly say, and suddenly they become funny. Being called a policewoman doesn't bother me at all, because I know it covers both women and men. Andrew, policewoman, age 40. Or let's take my hometown baseball team of the Cleveland Indians. Flip it to test it. How would you feel to be up in the stands cheering for the Cleveland Caucasians? Now, maybe you're thinking, this doesn't happen to me. And maybe you're right. Maybe you are a superhuman person who manages to intercept those brain shortcuts at exactly the right moment to ensure you're behaving bias-free and consistently with your values and beliefs in all of your actions. It could very well be. But what have you got to lose to double-check yourself? If we all started to flip it to test it, we might just be surprised at how often we would choose to behave differently. Because what if you're missing an opportunity to see the world differently? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a new concept. Flip it to test it. I thought that was pretty interesting when I heard it, because I thought, it gives us another tool for the toolkit of how can we start looking at things differently, especially when we're making important decisions, and voting is an important decision. How can we start changing the dynamics of what we see happening if we're not open to another point of view, or what someone else is saying, because we can't even hear what they're saying because we can't get past whatever unconscious bias is holding us back. So this is about continuing to be aware. And, if you're just joining us and you're just starting to listening to the One Human Nation show, or this is something that just has recently come on your radar, I recognize that it's difficult, especially when things happen that seem so unfair and unjust. It's painful. It's a very painful process. It's a painful part of the society that we live in. But to me, we can't just ignore it. We can't just pretend that it's not there. We have to really kind of open it up and put it under a spotlight to go, okay, what's really going on here, especially when it's our stuff that we're dealing with. It's easy to judge someone else, but it's a lot harder when we start looking at what do we need to do to unpack our own stuff. And that's where it gets to be a lot more complicated and a lot more complex. Well, it is time for us to take a little break and make some announcements. So that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to come back and listen to some more information from someone with a different insight of how we need to kind of flip the switch in how we think about things that are creating disparities, preventing us from becoming one human nation, one human community. It's all about the journey. So I'll be back with you in 1 minute after making some announcements. Park Place Outreach is an emergency shelter that provides services for youth who are homeless, runaway, or victims of abuse, and is the only facility in Chatham County to which children can self-report without a family or agency referral. The program also provides a street outreach to identify and help at-risk youth. If you need help, know someone at risk of becoming a runaway, or would like more information, call 912-234-4048 or visit parkplaceyes.org. If you've just tuned in, you're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. WRUU brings you the most diverse and passionate local radio programming on the air in Savannah. This all-volunteer and nonprofit community radio station accepts no money from any form of government. Our diversity and independence is made possible only through the generous financial support of listeners like you. We rely on your annual and ongoing monthly contributions to cover the many costs associated with bringing you our broadcast and web programming. If you are a contributor, thank you. If you're not yet a contributor, please show your appreciation of the role WRUU plays in your life by becoming a contributor in any amount. You can donate quickly and easily by credit card or check. Just find the donate and subscribe links at WRUU.org. Thanks for listening to and supporting WRUU. Well, welcome back to the One Human Nation show, and we're talking about the ongoing topic of how do we go through reconciliation in this country, as well as in our community. And there have been some traumatic things that have also happened locally recently in the Savannah community that those of you that are listening that live in Savannah are well aware of also. So one of the things I do want to stress as part of taking care of yourself through this reconciliation journey is I realize that it can be very emotional. And one of the areas that I think it really creates this tension and discomfort and anger in some cases, resentment, guilt, is when we have to deal with this whole construct of racism and how it permeates our systems, our institutions, whether we're talking about law enforcement, whether we're talking about our public school systems, and I can go on and on. So we're going to take a listen to Dr. Robin DiAngelo, because I think she really does, and this is her world of what she lives in. She does a really good job of breaking down how we have to really rethink this whole topic of racism and being considered a racist, and what that looks like in your world, especially if you're a part of the dominant culture. So let's take a listen to Dr. Robin DiAngelo.
Clever, effective adaptation of racism post-civil rights is what I call the good-bad binary, right? So post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, because racism's bad. But you always have to ask yourself, how does it function? And I would say it functions beautifully to make it very, very difficult to get white people to look at what we've internalized, the messages we've internalized, our privilege, our investments. Because what we hear, if you try to connect us to the system, is, you just said I was a bad person. And that is unbearable to me. And I'm going to put everything I have into countering that attack. Have you ever seen a white person get defensive in a conversation about racism? Anybody? Okay. And if you yourself are feeling a little defensive, just ask yourself, is this rooted in this idea that she's suggesting I'm a bad person, right? And I'm not, by the way. but you can see how effective it is. So if we're going to fill this in, we know that a racist is ignorant and bigoted and prejudiced and mean-spirited and old and Southern, and they drive pickup trucks because we got to get some classism in there, right? That's your racist. And your not racist is good. And they're educated and progressive and open-minded and well-intended and young and Northern, and they live in Portland, and they they shop at Whole Foods. And okay, this is get rid of this, right? I mean, try really hard. I know that's easier said than done, but this way of positioning you're either a good person or a bad person, or you're a good white or a bad white, is just not useful. All of us have been conditioned to participate, and this is getting in the way. And our films, our movies reinforce this idea. There's usually the good whites and the bad whites, and we totally identify with the good whites. And it's just, again, not useful.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're, continuing our journey into deconstructing or taking a closer look at how we operate on a day-to-day basis, and how we can start taking a closer look at our interactions and activities that we're engaged in and what we're involved in. So one of the topics of today's show is this whole topics of the whole entire topic of ethnocentrism in our history. And so we've mentioned before that, when you're coming from an ethnocentric point of view, it's the way I look at the world is the right way. It's the only way. And so if you look at this in present day politics, so let's take a look at the bigger picture here, the present day politics of the United States. And I'm not going to talk about, Republican or Democratic. I'm talking about the politics of when we decide as a country to engage with another nation because they're not doing something right or they're doing something very wrong. And so ever since the conception of the United States, the thought process for us is that we are the more powerful nation, we are more economically sound, and we're just generally better than the other nations. So then, unfortunately, that creates the dynamic for us as a country that we have a tendency to get involved with affairs that may be beyond the scope of what we need to be involved in. For example, in the Middle East. So although the idea of every citizen in the United States belonging to one ethnicity or not is certainly debatable, because we are getting to be more and more of a multicultural world in this particular country. There is this feeling of national pride that we live in a wonderful country. We live in a fantastic country. And I've often, I'll say it again. I love the United States of America. We are a wonderful nation, but we're not perfect. So when we start looking at this concept of ethnocentrism, we can also then look at how did this play out with European imperialism? So imperialism was a practice of taking over other lands, heavily practiced by Europe starting in the 16th century. So you kind of know where this is going, right? The colonies in the United States were one of the regions that the Europeans tried to control from overseas. They also took over lands in Africa, and it just wasn't limited to that. And it's typically societies that were deemed to be more primitive societies, and they felt like they needed to take over because they were the better European ethnocentric point of view, and that's still evident in a lot of what happens today. So as part of this reconciliation journey, it's really trying to get our heads around, how do we get beyond thinking of our way is the best way, our way is the only way, because it also has an impact when we start looking at the dynamics on our governance at a local level, our city council and the interaction. And I've mentioned before how important it is for you to at least try to catch the replays on television of the work sessions for the city council, as well as the city council meetings, and the same thing with the school board, because I can tell you, when you can start watching the dynamics, you start realizing that some of what's happening with communication really is based on that person's point of view and how they're looking at their concept of the world. Their way of doing things is the best way of doing things. This comes to play out even when you start looking at the dynamics between North and South. There is this, there seems to be, this dynamics with people that move from the North to the South, that Southerners are just basically slow. They talk slow, they move slow, they work slow. And so there is just this, there's that perception out there, especially when you come from an environment where everything is very, to the point, and the pace is different, the words are different. It's very easy to assume, well, therefore they must be inferior, or therefore they are not as smart as, because and so I start seeing, when I'm looking at these different groups that are meeting, there was one city council meeting that I was watching, and there was a city council member that actually started talking about her education. And she was doing that because she was being put in a position to defend herself. It was this back and forth question, or trying to get a resolution on an issue. And I don't remember what it even was now at this point. I just remember, her going into, well, I understand it because I have a math degree, or I have a master's in the, it was this and she was an African-American female that serves on the city council. There's several that serve on the city council, so you're going to have to kind of look back at sessions and kind of figure out who I'm talking about. But I realized that, it doesn't matter the level of education. It's still that concept that, especially for an African-American female, that they have to defend. This is what I'm knowledgeable about this. I'm asking questions so that I can have a better understanding. Doesn't mean that I'm ignorant about the topic. It means I need to have a better understanding. So we're going to take a break, and I'm going to talk about another dynamic that I had mentioned. Actually, we had the guests on the show before, and it's something that's still percolating, that still speaks to me of why we really need to look at reconciliation and what happens in our community, and, who comes out on the short end of that when we're not engaged and having a voice in what happens in our community. So we're going to take a short break, and I'll be back with the One Human Nation show. You're listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with Global Soul. I just realized that you probably weren't hearing me because I had the mic turned down. So welcome back. And we're going to talk a little bit about something that I had a guest on the show talking about the situation with sexual assault and the process of rape kits in Savannah. And so during my journey of listening to different city council meetings, I happened to have the opportunity to observe the dynamics between the director of the Rape Crisis Center here in Savannah and information she was presenting. And as she was presenting this information, I could tell that it was creating some disconnect or discomfort with the people that were hearing this information. And the discomfort was in reference to how inadequate the work that was being done in making the arrest and going through the backlog of rape kits. And so she was very emphatic about it. She was very, she had the statistics to it. And to fast forward, most recently, that's come to my attention that it triggered this response. And I'm still trying to get my head around what was the purpose of this response, but it triggered a response from a variety of people in the Savannah community that was driven by the district attorney's office, because of course part of this, and this is why it's important that it has nothing to do, when you start thinking about good people, bad people. That's why I wanted us to listen to the Robin DiAngelo talking about the good bad binary. It's like, why did this happen? So it was a letter that was signed by different community members, including different law enforcement departments, basically saying that they wanted to have a meeting with the board of this particular agency because they didn't like what was being said. I mean, I'm kind of condensing things here, but that's what it really came down to. And it wasn't about the accuracy of information that was being said, but they just felt like communications had broken down, and they wanted to meet with the board to see what they could do to repair, I guess, the relationship. And it just started me triggering this whole, just kind of triggered this response in me as an African American female. Is like, well, is the information accurate? And if it's accurate, then what are we doing to address the issue? Because it does impact, especially African Americans also, because, we're on the bottom end of how long does it take for even the response time when it's an African American that's involved as a victim. And then there's an African American female that's the director for this rape crisis center that's trying to facilitate and move things forward instead of just kind of accepting the status quo that, well, we've got a backlog and we, working through it, or, it shined a spotlight in a way that it made people uncomfortable. And that's what I'm trying to get to. It's that we have to get beyond the discomfort. We have to really start looking at what's the information, what's the impact to the community, and how we can fix it. So as we start thinking through and start looking at the elections that are coming up, I do want to remind you that there are key areas in any community, and I know we look at what happens on the national level, and we should. I referenced at the top of the hour the comments that were made to the National Sheriff's Association that was really a very coded language of protecting the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement. As we start looking at where elections are and who's going to be running for office, we really have to start asking some serious questions about how do we move beyond looking at personalities, and is there something that is triggered in us with unconscious bias that is preventing us moving to the next level? Because everything is not all easily digestible, and I see a lot of complex issues, and there's always the way that you get people distracted is that you divide them, and it's divide and conquer. And I want us to be aware of when you see these things happening or something is resonating within you, that you take a moment and go, wait a minute, where is this coming from? Why is this being said? What's really happening here? Take a look at the data and make your own decisions. And I know for some it's difficult because you're working, and raising a family, and there are so many things to be engaged in, but we have to look at some key areas in our community. And for Savannah, the areas that I look at are what happens with the city council, who's on the city council, what's their position on different issues, are they aware of the disparity and what needs to happen to gap that disparity. And one of the things with the city of Savannah is in the support of the school board and their moving forward with the Renaissance plan, because I'm sure it's going to involve some conversations with the city, as well as probably some funding from the city and some support from the city. And I could already tell when that conversation was introduced, there was pushback. And I totally get it, because this program looks at what other social services need to be included for these 3 to 5 year olds. Well, when I went to school, first of all, I didn't start going to school at 3 years old. I had a relative, my actually great grandmother, that lived with us, and I guess you can say I was homeschooled until the first grade. But that was then, and this is now. And if we don't start addressing are all the children well, we're going to continue to see the problems that we have with the violence in our youth as they get older. The problems don't go away. So I encourage you, as we come to the end of today's show, just to kind of make a note of the areas to look at. Look at who is the person that has the authority, that's in that sheriff's position, that is an elected position. Who is in the position of DA? That's that's another area to look at. In addition to city council, mayor, city manager, another position that is in the works for Savannah is who's going to be the new chief of police for Savannah. That's a critical position that's going to be filled. And how is that happening? I've mentioned the school board and what that looks like, and who is going to be running for president, who are going to be running for some of the seats that are going to be open on this board. How are they going to be working with the current superintendent, who happens to be African American female? And if you look at some of their meetings, you can see that there's some tension there. There's some disconnect there. I don't know all the dynamics. I don't know any of the people involved. I just observe the conversation, and I listen and try to interpret from there and try to get to what's the real meaning, what's the real push behind this. And so I think it is something that all of us, as part of being a part of this community, need to be aware of. And I recognize that it can be very sensitive. I recognize that we at times just don't want to deal with it, because it's just, we just feel like, what, it's just too much. I would prefer just to go along my happy way and not have to deal with the disparities in our community. But Savannah is not a big city. It's a wonderful city. We have many visitors to our city, and we're actually, the way I look at it, we're playing catch up. There are things in the city that should have been taken care of decades ago, and now we have generational problems that appear to be out of control, but they're not. We just have to take them in bite-sized pieces. But you have to listen and really hear what people are saying and be informed, so you can ask the questions and the tough questions. And it may make people uncomfortable, but that's what we need to do so that we can move towards being one human nation. It requires all of us to be involved and engaged, no matter how difficult and no matter how uncomfortable it makes us feel. So we're actually coming to the end of today's show, and up next is Stone. I'm looking for my notes, because for some reason I just went totally blank. Sound Limit with Troy. That's it. Sound Limit. Sound Limit with Troy Stoner. So as we get ready for that, I do encourage you to take care of yourself. I wish I could tell you that it probably won't be another, that things will be calm for the next couple of days and everything will be great and wonderful. But that's Pollyanna Sandy. That's not reality Sandy. So I encourage you to just be prepared and to take care of yourself and continue moving on in your reconciliation journey. And I hope you tune in next week on Thursday to the One Human Nation show.